So yeah, my name is Stephen Waterhouse. I am CEO and co-founder of Orchid, and I'm going to be talking about scary subject, surveillance and surveillance capitalism. So I've been on the internet for a really long time, since 1989. I had an email address back then, and then spent a lot of time working in Silicon Valley since the late 90s on many different technologies. When we really sort of, the beginnings of the internet was very much a place which was a place of exploration and discovery, and really radically open in the way that we thought about using it. But that didn't last, and over the emergence of a number of different business models, the initial dot-com wave, which was really architected around a very centralized technology, and then the emergence of social media and all things that we've become very familiar with. Really using the internet today is very much kind of taking a risk. You're really not sure what's happening, who's tracking you, what's going on. We have also a series of very much walled gardens, where everyone's activity is very closely monitored and manipulated. And the coronavirus, COVID-19, has really hastened. I feel like it's an acceleration of history, not really an alternative history, but just kind of an acceleration of what was probably going to happen anyway. Many people are working from home now, living more of their lives online. In spite of the openings up, we're seeing companies like Facebook and Twitter talking about having complete work from home options. And so we're starting to sort of see the dissolution of the standard work-home division. And during this period, the vulnerabilities which are inherent in our online life are becoming much more apparent. And the question really is that even after this crisis is over, hoping that it is, there's potentially a situation where many of these changes to our daily routines will stick around, and also concerns about the privacy that is the implication there. In addition, governments are really looking now for many ways to track and monitor the populations to control the spread of COVID-19. And whilst this is obviously necessary to try and trying to stop the spread of the virus is necessary, these technologies also open the door to abuse of this data and questions about what it might be used for outside of an epidemic. It's really, you only have to open the paper, and there's obviously a lot of very intense news at the moment around not only the virus and the crisis there, but also the civil unrest that's happening in the United States and around the world. And the stories of people being tracked and that data being used for different reasons which they weren't aware of or didn't give it permission for, or maybe they did but they didn't realize what they were giving them permission for, are everywhere. Global internet surveillance is extremely kind of toxic and widespread. In many parts of the world, we have a combination of corporate control and surveillance and government control and surveillance. On the government side, China, with the Great Firewall, which is really a collection of different technologies, is one of the best well-known. But in the US and in Europe also, many parts of the world, you have large corporations collecting and retaining large quantities of data. Often, some of this is also shared with governments. Some of the abuses there were highlighted by Snowden. And even though we have new rules or relatively recent rules such as GDPR and CCPA in California, these are regulations, and it's not clear whether these are really helping privacy or just adding in a lot of red tape without addressing the core kind of problem here. As I was saying earlier, crises tend to accelerate trends. They need large-scale coordinated responses, and this often leads to a permanent expansion of a government's power over citizens at the expense of civil liberties. Repressive regimes have often turned to national emergencies to claim really broad powers over their people. For example, Egypt has been in a declared state of emergency for the last 50 years. And during that time, opposition parties have been banned, elections cancelled, media censored, and people jailed indefinitely without charge. And this playbook has been followed by many countries, including like Venezuela and others. The use of national emergencies, whether they're real or not, to tighten restrictions on freedom is not limited to what we think of as dictatorships. In the United States after 9/11, the Patriot Act allowed for indefinite detention of immigrants and expanded federal ability to wiretap citizens. And even 2 decades later, this Patriot Act has actually recently just been renewed and is still in force. So there's every reason to be concerned that this safety in exchange for freedom bargain is going to expand in the wake of the pandemic. There's been a lot of praise initially around China's authoritarian response, which still has questions around exactly how successful it's been. And then in the West, we have calls that democratic government should put more severe restrictions on behavior, even as societies open up, and we're not sure exactly what's going to happen in the next 6 months, 9 months, as we may get second or third waves here. But this pandemic on the largest scale is really has the potential to push us past a tipping point beyond which our privacy could be really hard or impossible to regain. Ironically, a lot of these risks to privacy are really possible because of all of the incredible technological progress we've made over the last 30 years. The internet revolution has made our lives definitely more convenient and the world more connected. And you can access any piece of knowledge you like at your fingertips. But there's also a dark side here, is that everything you do leaves a trail that's really invisible from your perspective and difficult to get rid of. And we're starting to see that people are really starting to understand this. Initially, I guess, with Snowden, and then Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. There's been a number of scandals, and when there isn't the kind of overwhelming news barrage around pandemics and civil unrest, typically you'll see a hack or other kind of major event where people are getting the data is being exploited and exposed very quickly. So what we're realizing here is that these business models where you think things are free is actually very costly, and the cost is you're the product. And there's a lot of understanding now. 3 years ago when we started this company, many people asked us whether we really thought privacy was an issue. And I don't like to be proved right in these situations, but in this case, definitely the understanding of why privacy is important and what's actually happening out there is getting higher. And I think that this is becoming part of people's narrative now as they understand what's happening in the world on a more extensive level. And as I said earlier, the real challenge here was that the first wave of business models on the internet were really, and the ones that we still have today, were really based around an architecture which was centralized. And with Web3 and blockchain technology, cryptocurrencies, decentralized systems, whatever the phrase you want to use for it is, we have the chance to change that and build an architecture and systems which could be fundamentally different in the way that they make money, the way that they protect privacy. One of the technologies that is very much a kind of something that you should all be thinking about using if you're concerned about privacy is virtual private networks. VPNs allow you to essentially shield your internet traffic through, initially in the main sense, through a VPN server. So essentially you're providing indirection between your traffic that's coming from your computer and the website or other internet resource which you're accessing. The VPN then is the entity that's capturing the traffic, and the website only really sees that the traffic is coming from VPN. It doesn't know that it's coming from you as an individual. But there's a number of challenges here with VPNs in the standard format. First of all, again, as you probably heard me describe, this is a centralized design. So you have to trust the VPN. You have to trust that VPN is not going to track your data. You're going to have to trust that VPN is not going to sell your data, and many of them do, or respond to a request for that information from a centralized entity. We designed something different. So with Orchid, what we've built is a decentralized VPN technology. We have, in turning on Orchid, what you are downloading is a simple mobile client. We also have desktop clients that are being released very soon. And that client is then connecting to one or a number of different nodes or providers within the network. When we started the company, we launched with, sorry, I'm getting lost on my slides. We launched with a number of existing VPN providers, companies like Private Internet Access, Liquid VPN, and others. But in addition, anyone can go and run their own node or their own, essentially, VPN. It's almost like thinking about this technology as allows you to be your own VPN and really change the narrative around the concept of VPNs being centralized into saying that we're building a system where VPNs are decentralized. One of the challenges of building something like a decentralized VPN on existing architectures, and in our system, we chose the Ethereum blockchain because of its widespread use, decentralization, and just really the scope and really magnitude of that project is how to scale things. We've seen, probably heard in many talks in Web3 or other conversations about the problems of scaling blockchain solutions. The solution we built builds a system called nanopayments, probabilistic nanopayments, in which we are able to really scale the traffic and the speed of the blockchain payments that we use to a speed which is comfortable for data networking. In addition, we provide the ability to string together different providers in what we call hops. And the idea with these hops is that no one node within the network or provider in the network is able to see all of your traffic from terms of where you started from and where you're going to. So if you put multiple hops in the Orchid system, you're able to shield your IP address and information about who you are and where you're going. So what we're trying to build on a larger level is really a suite of privacy tools, mobile first, but increasingly offering these on desktop environments because of just how many more people are working from home. And really just always completely enabled by these decentralized approaches, and really kind of build different marketplaces, initially with bandwidth, for different services that could be offered within that environment. Here's some of our partners, as I mentioned earlier. We're currently traded on a number of exchanges. I think Kraken is the most recent one, which should have been added here. And we are international. We are translated and available in multiple languages globally. And it's available today. You can get it on Google Play and currently on test flights on iOS and coming soon to the iOS store. I think I'm out of time. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that presentation. So for those of you who have questions for Stephen, please do pop them in the Q&A poll, and he'll be back on joining the next panel, which I'll be introducing. And yeah, there'll be a Q&A happening at 6 p.m. UK time. So now we've got a very exciting panel coming up on this topic. So to moderate the panel, it's my great pleasure to introduce Sebastian Kutcher, the co-founder and host of Epicenter, one of the best tech podcasts covering the blockchain and cryptocurrency industry. So over to you, Seb.
Thanks, Samantha. I'm very excited to be here to welcome our panel today to follow up on Stephen's talk on freedom and civic duties. And so I'd like to ask the producer to bring on my panelists if possible. All right. Hi, everybody. So briefly to introduce everybody, I'll let everybody introduce themselves. So to my left or my right, I don't know how you guys are looking at this. I've got Yaya Fanusie, Liz Steininger, Cory Doctorow, and Harry Halpin. And so could we please get a brief round of introductions from all of you? Yaya, why don't you go first?
Hi, everyone. I'm a senior adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security, which is a national security think tank in Washington, D.C. I come from the experience working in the U.S. government. My focus actually is on national security issues. So I look at technology, particularly financial technology, through that lens, but happy to be here.
Liz.
Hi, I'm Liz Steininger from Least Authority. We care a lot about security and privacy. Security basically enables people to have privacy, especially on tech. So we do security consulting where we do security audits, and also we build secure storage tools and also secure file transfer, things like that. So we care a lot about open source secure software, both on the helping other projects side and also contributing our own projects.
Cory.
Hi, I'm Cory Doctorow. I write science fiction novels, and I am a special consultant with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. It's a nonprofit that has fought on issues related to privacy, security, and other civil liberties online for more than 30 years now. I'm a visiting professor of computer science at the Open University in the UK, and a visiting professor of library science at the University of North Carolina, as well as a research affiliate at the Media Lab. And my work mostly interrogates the connection between monopoly, competition, privacy, and security.
And last but not least, Harry.
Hi, I'm Harry Halpin. I'm the CEO of NIM Technologies, a company which is trying to build a sort of next generation, some Tor VPN-like product, which is even more secure and private than existing VPNs, even against nation-state level adversaries like the CIA. And I used to work at MIT and the French government on cryptography.
Great. So when I was approached to do this panel and to bring together some potential panelists for this panel, I thought, okay, how could I get like a diverse set of opinions around this? And so, I think here what we have is really quite an interesting group of people, because we have a technologist, we have a security expert, we have a national security expert and someone who comes from the government background, and we have an author, thinker, activist. So I think we're going to get some really interesting insights here on this topic, which is, it couldn't be more pressing and it couldn't be the topic du jour. And, I think if we would have all sat down 2 months ago and had this conversation, we probably would have said things like, oh, this is like such a crazy situation that we're in. It seems now that the level of insanity and sort of craziness of the situation has risen to another level. But we're going to address all of that. First, I'd like to ask all of you, perhaps in the same order, whichever order you like, in the events that have been unfolding in the last 2 weeks, what is the one thing that comes to mind which made your ears stand up or sort of, surprised you the most? What is the one thing that you're taking away from the situation that's unfolding currently?
I'll go first and maybe say the easiest thing, right? Which obviously is not just the pandemic. Okay, that would be too easy. But I would say in this pandemic happening, the fact that masses of people have voluntarily, or I should say sort of submitted to restrictions on their freedom, restrictions on their movement, something that none of us probably could have imagined. And you could say that if you think about some of these social issues and social unrest going, that that has actually enabled some of some of what we're seeing. Enabled in the sense that people are, they aren't working. They are staying at home. So that's it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think personally, and maybe people around me too, but personally, I think I underestimated I didn't anticipate so much change would happen so fast. And I think that's something that's easy that we do. We take for granted what we've got. We continue going on with things as usual. And so I've seen both change in good and bad directions. People being made aware of the issues of privacy, but then at the same time, like was just said, that people are also giving up certain freedoms surprisingly quickly too. So it's just the pace of things has changed, and I underestimated that.
I think that for me, the most illuminating thing has been this exercise in understanding and watching the demonstrations of the lack of confidence or the confidence in our public institutions. When people stay home, it's because they believe the state. When people go out, it's because they don't. And watching how the erosion of institutional capacity and institutional credibility has led to a rise of sort of cults of personality that when we lack legitimate truth-seeking exercises that can tell us whether or not we should be taking chloroquine or whether we should be staying at home or whether we should be wearing masks. Instead, you just end up like nominating an expert and hoping they're right. And so we have these cults of personality around the president, around different business leaders and so on, where people, rather than using the method and adversarial peer review to decide what's true, just trust a leader who's oftentimes just winging it.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is that I think I lost a lot of hope during Corona. I felt that we might be entering a period in which we will all voluntarily sacrifice our privacy and our freedom and our fundamental rights for our own health. And I think that's a reasonable thing to do. I'm very proud of people who stay inside. That being said, I'm even more proud of the people who took to the streets in the United States to fight the violent and racist U.S. police. And I hope at some point the United States reforms itself such that it will become something more like, to be honest, a relatively functional direct democracy, which we see in places like Switzerland or even Rojava in northeast Syria, where the community polices itself and that fundamental rights are respected and not arbitrarily overrun by sort of pseudo-authoritarians like Trump or second-rate police departments.
So let's perhaps address the title of this talk. I mean, I think if you talk to most people, and perhaps it's also one of the reasons why this talk is titled this way. You have freedom versus civic duties. So it's there seems to be two opposing forces here. And I think most people will probably look at it that way. Is it correct to look at these two concepts as orthogonal, or what's the framework that one should apply to these two concepts in order to apply them to different situations whenever needed?
Well, I'm happy to take a stab at it if no one else will jump in there. I think that ultimately all performances of civic duty are voluntary, at least at scale and over time, because there just aren't enough cops to follow you around and make sure you're wearing a mask. That civic duty ultimately rests on voluntary compliance. And so what I think we've been engaged in for many years is a kind of seeking of equilibrium between doing things that reduce our social cohesion, like allowing for mass inequality or other expressions of corruption that make us feel like we're not in it together, and to still retain a kind of social equilibrium by spying on people, right? If you spy on people, then with systems, with machines, then you don't need guard labor. You can move the curve over to the point where you need to start acting in the public good instead of for the private good of connected insiders. You move it over to a place that would otherwise be less stable. And I think that where you see people being very skeptical of exposure notification apps, what are sometimes wrongly called contact tracing apps, that one of the things they're worried about is that we are substituting the social cohesion that makes real contact tracing work, where you have trust relationships between individuals that cause them to disclose things like who they've been with and where they've been, with automated systems of enforcement that dispense with the need for legitimacy before people comply.
Yeah, and I'll step in really quickly and actually go even further. So I think we do have a profound duty, but that duty is to each other. It is to our neighbors, our friends, our loved ones, to our future generations and to past generations, and to the natural world, which we are all embedded in, which is now threatened by climate change. It's not just Corona. And I think the problem is that originally, when it was formed, the nation state was supposed to essentially have a duty to the people. But instead, a lot of nation states, and I would definitely include the United States in this, have been hijacked by what is clearly small business elites, whose interest is primarily not to help and defend the population, which is what, my grandfather's a police officer, father was in the military. That's a very strong and powerful thing. But the duty of the state should not be to control its population, to spy on its population. That's the sign of a state which is in terminal decline, which is more afraid of its population than anything else. And when you look at the NSA warrantless surveillance, when you look at the recent actions against people like Ola Benny or Julian Assange, if you look at the actions that the U.S. state has been taking against protesters, Trump calling for the military, and the abuse of the National Guard, yes, I think that we are witnessing in the United States something resembling the end of the Roman Empire. And our best bet to survive this is a duty to each other and to defend each other's privacy using the best decentralized technical tools we have.
Hey, can I jump in?
Please.
I like that that the Roman Empire was mentioned. It's interesting if you think about this word civic, which has a relationship to the city, civil, and civilization, because civic, I believe, in my extensive research on Google.com, but really sort of the origins of civic, I think when it was first used in the Latin, was used with Corona Civic, or Civica, Corona Civica, which was a crown that was given in ancient Rome to someone who had saved the life of a citizen, of someone of the city. So this word, which means, city, comes from the root city, gained popularity, the idea of civic, with the idea of saving your fellow citizen, right, from Rome. Two things. One, it's interesting to note that this idea of civic life and being protected, that this is actually, I think, strengthened. If we have civilizational awareness, we think about the past millennia. It's actually been strengthened in the past 200 years, or 200 plus years, and then the past 70 years, we've had more civic protection, civil liberties, and then in the last 30 years around the world, around the globe, right? So I think it's important to think of things in a sort of, with the hindsight of millennia of history behind us. Just to give us context that what we're dealing with now is unique. So we're dealing with this expectation where we've had over the past several decades so much civil freedom, probably the best humanity has had globally, right, over the past few decades. Now, what's happening now? Now we're dealing with crises, but we have technology which is unprecedented. And so how are we going to manage that? How are we going to solve that? This is something every society is going to have to address. But the key, in my mind, the thing I'll say that I'll leave behind is technology is only going to be a part, and technology can't be the cure-all, because, again, that millennia of history will show us that at the end of the day, protection of rights enforced by governments has really been what has been able to do that. So we have to deal with where those rights are being infringed upon. But I would be very careful about trusting that just the technology will be the tool. If we don't have a political environment that is accountable, if we don't have a system which allows its citizens to redress and address grievances and issues, if you don't have that, technology can be stamped out.
Liz, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think this is what, I mean, to tie some of that together, like there's just a concept that, so we know that privacy should be a human right. And I mean, you look throughout history and privacy has been something that people seek out in some form. And we've dealt with this issue over and over again in different ways as new technology, whether it be the digital era or past technologies like photographs or something like that have come into being. We've had to adjust ourselves. And so I think it's also comforting to think that, like, while technology is definitely a tool for us that helps us now, that also humans are just like driven to have some elements of privacy. And if we're not going to have that right, we will, I mean, it's like, yeah, tying it back to civic duty, we have a duty to each other too, to like seek that out in whatever ways possible. And yeah, so privacy is not dead. It's tried to be, and people thought it was dead many, many times before. And we're going to find.
Did we lose her?
Uh-oh.
Liz, are you still with us?
Sorry.
A way through this too, but yeah, tech is a piece of it, but also
the internet.
Okay, Liz, I think we're
tech is not the answer.
No, it's not. So I'd like to circle back to this idea of privacy, because we have been talking a little more about like freedom and civic duties here, but let's talk about privacy. I mean, social media has been accused over the years, and perhaps more so recently, of being such a radicalizing force in today's democratic and political debate. And some have also contested these claims. The jury's not out on that yet, but it appears true that we're entering like a new information and behavioral landscape. And things like absolute truths are becoming increasingly difficult to establish. Now, some have, so for example, Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist at New York University's Stern School of Business, he's been studying social media trends for some time, and in his research has sort of proposed this idea that social networks should at least have some sort of human verification mechanism whereby to open a social media account, one would need to have their identity verified in some way to at least establish that the person that is behind this keyboard is a person and it's not some, say, foreign government organization, or may also restrict certain behaviors like death threats and things like that, right? People may be less inclined to get involved in that sort of behavior if their real identities were perhaps identifiable. In a place like America or in Western Europe, that might be a solution to some of the extreme things that I mentioned earlier. But in other countries, that's obviously not desirable. And who knows? Perhaps in the U.S. and the next presidential after the next presidential election, that might also not be desirable. If a certain person is elected to the White House. So how do we, that's sort of a long-winded way to ask the question. So how do we make sure that moving forward, the social networks don't become an even more radicalizing force, and that we don't exacerbate all of these problems? Are you guys in favor, or what's your stance or position on this idea of a real names policy or like a real identities policy?
I mean, I'm happy to speak to that.
I'm a fan of choice.
Yeah, Liz, go first.
I'll just quickly say I'm a fan of choice, that I think that there are some cases where it might be good for you to be able to prove your identity But I think that it's also really important that people don't have to always have an identity, especially when they're on the unpopular side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to state that I'm 100% against such rules or regulations. That effectively the name of our company, NIM, you may recognize from pseudonym or anonymous, it's Greek for name, that people should have the right to choose their own name, to choose how they present themselves and how they selectively disclose themselves to the world. And this is a right which is not given to us by governments, which is not given to us by technology platforms, but is a right, just like the right not to be killed by the police, the fundamental right to life. It's a right that we have to struggle for. And technology should be a tool which enables us to struggle for this right, for these rights. I think it's very disingenuous to basically blame social media for the current problems our society has, which in my opinion are clearly caused by things such as inequality, what appears to be the senile behavior of our presidential ruling class. All of these things have nothing to do with Twitter or Facebook, but what they do have a lot to do with is the breakdown of a social system and the lack of the ability to create a new one. And we need to give people the tools to create a new one themselves.
I think I think a lot of these things are intertwined. I mean, just by observation, right? I mean, it's sort of, is it the chicken or the egg if you're going to blame social media or not? If you're going to say it's societal and that social media is just a vessel, well, how do you know? How do you know they're not both impacting? I mean, in sort of observation, you see behavior on social media that's prevalent that you didn't see publicly when we didn't have social media. But regardless, I think one thought I have is that I'm not so much personally in a fan of a policy option for this, right? So like, how can we make social media so that people don't act a certain way, so that people, I mean, that's social, that's culture, and really policy is really often ineffective with hearts, minds, and culture, right? Because that's sort of a different part of human existence. Policy tries to get at it, and there are things you can do, but it can be very oppressive once you start doing a policy for a cultural revolution, if you want to call it that. What I would say, stepping away from the policy, I think it would be interesting to see more social initiatives for operating differently on social media. I mean, if certain things can go viral, why can't maybe this is contradictory, but what about a sort of like a social media campaign to stay off social media? I did something years ago. This is not social media related, but several years ago when I was not working in government and I was basically working as an entrepreneur, I went through about a year in my life when I turned off all news. I was no longer, reading the Washington Post. I was no longer listening to NPR because of just a lot of other reasons. Like, I just was not consuming that. And this was when there was a lot of stuff going on. I don't think I was uninformed because I would hear whatever I would need to hear. But that exercise of that year of doing that, it makes me consume media very differently. And I actually don't consume as much as I think many people do. So that was just a personal thing. I think people should find ways to get themselves off of social media when they can.
So I think that we give the tech platforms far too much credit when we say that they have changed people's minds and made them into sociopathic monsters. I mean, let's start with the caliber of arguments fielded for the various conspiracies that have become a mainstay on social media and in the critiques of social media, like the flat earth or eugenics or anti-vax. The arguments for these positions have not gotten better in the last 20, 30 years. If you go back and read anti-vax claims from the days of the Salk vaccine, they weren't making better arguments than they were now. And yet, clearly, a lot more people believe them. And the explanation that the tech platforms have somehow used big data and machine learning to bypass people's critical faculties and insert the idea of the flat earth into their minds is one that seems to rest almost entirely on the marketing claims that big tech makes for itself when they're trying to court advertisers. Give us money and we'll sell refrigerators or fidget spinners or whatever, and we can sell anything to anyone because we have machine learning and big data. I mean, maybe they're telling the truth, but I don't usually start with sales literature when I'm trying to find out where the truth lies. So rather than assuming that big tech has finally perfected a mind control ray and acknowledging that people believe things that have not gotten more credible over the last couple of decades, we're left with the question, why do people continue to believe in it? And my thesis is that they believe in it because they don't trust our truth-seeking exercises, because our truth-seeking exercises aren't very good. If you scratch an anti-vaxxer, you will often find someone who knows chapter and verse about how the Sackler family suborned the FDA and were allowed to market OxyContin and kick off the opioid epidemic that's killed more Americans than the Vietnam War did. They have a good reason not to trust the FDA when the FDA says vaccines are not safe. I mean, I think they're wrong, but I understand the reasoning. As to whether we should then fix this by forcing people to use their real names, we've kind of gone down this road already. We saw it with the NIM wars on G+. We've seen it with Facebook. And what we know about real names policies is that powerful demagogues don't mind having their real names put to terrible ideas. Tom Cotton will handily take to the editorial pages of the New York Times and call for the burning of the Reichstag. Really what you see when you tell people that they must be identified in order to participate in public life is that people who are vulnerable are excluded from those conversations. People who have yet to disclose their sexual identity, or the fact that they use cannabis, or the fact that they believe that interracial marriage shouldn't be a crime, or when any of the other things that have changed over the last several decades, those people are not able to freely speak their minds.
Right. I don't think that really the we're arguing here is for real names. Perhaps I didn't make that clear in the question, but more for real persons, right? So you could perhaps be identified as anonymous, but in order to open an account, one would have to prove to some sort of a nonprofit or something like that they're in fact a real person, which would or could prevent the creation of thousands of
well. If the NSA can't keep its secrets from leaking, the random nonprofit we've just deputized to hold the real identity and all compromat on every human being alive is not going to do any better.
Good point.
Can I make a final point on this?
And I think that people need multiple identities in some cases
say again?
too.
Yeah, I didn't hear what you said.
Sorry if I froze. Oh, that also in some cases people need multiple identities. That they have different sides of themselves that they need to share with the world, and multiple identities are useful.
And also, I mean, I want to bring this back to Web3. The blockchain provides the ability for people to collectively and to some extent computationally determine some level of truth in a decentralized fashion. It's not very good at privacy, and it's something that I think we should all work to fix. But we have seen that it has had some success, at least with financial transactions. So I think the message that I would like people at the Web3 Foundation to look at is not regulating social media, but trying to create new forms of social media which give people increased freedom of speech, increased freedom of transactions, and increased privacy. And I think that these kinds of social media will be increasingly necessary to fight things like police brutality, which has been happening way before Twitter released the video on George Floyd. It's been happening since, and then the United States, it was just as bad before Twitter. Twitter didn't make police brutality or racial injustice happen. It just gave us the ability to see it if we had been isolated from it because we were privileged. So I think that it's creating these kinds of tools that I really want to see people focus on who happen to be programmers or who happen to be venture capitalists or who happen to be technologically savvy. And these tools are not for us to become rich like we saw in the original Web 2.0 boom, but we should create them as a service to society to help society reach its true potential, which is currently, I believe, being held back.
Any final thoughts before we wrap up? This has been a quick panel, but unfortunately we're out of time.
I wanted to pick up on something that Yaya said earlier that I really chimed with, which is that the point of our technological tools like cryptography is not to build like a stable demimonde in which we can exist and flourish with even though an illegitimate state is all around us, a state that is not caring for its citizens, that is not ruling with the consent of the governed. the point of cryptography is to build a temporary respite from the surveillance of that state so that we can foment a better state, one that is responsible, one that has civics. You know, the only defense against rubber hose cryptanalysis, which is when someone ties you to a chair and hits you with a rubber hose until you tell them what your password is not longer key lengths or better passwords. It's legitimate states where they don't operate black sites in Chicago for years, where the police take people that they suspect and hit them with rubber hoses.
Well, that's a good point to end on, I suppose. But yes, we do have to wrap up. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And if you want to ask questions, there's a Q&A session happening in a few minutes, and the URL should appear on your screen if you're watching this. So thank you to all of our panelists for chiming in today.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.